Please be seated. Thank you, Mr. O'Donnell, and to our singers. That was beautiful. Welcome, all of our new people and all of our visitors, and welcome back to everyone who's returning to St. John's. It's my pleasure to start us off with our Friday night lecture series, and it is my honor to give the Christopher B. Nelson Lecture tonight. Mr. Nelson is an alum of the college and was president of St. John's in Annapolis beginning in 1991. His presidency was marked by consistent care for a community of learning and lasted for more than 25 years, a remarkably long tenure for a college president. I'd like to take this opportunity to invite you all to the question period after lecture to be held in the conversation room. We call it the question period, not the question and answer period, so adjust your expectations accordingly. By tradition, students are allowed to ask the first few questions. I don't think I'm the only one in this room who has fallen in love with the motet by Palestrina that we just heard, based on the first verse of Psalm 42 entitled Sicut Cervus. The full text is Sicut Cervus desiderat ad fontes aquarum, ita desiderat anima mea ad te Deus. As the deer longs for the flowing streams, so longs my soul for you, O God. Like many of you, I began my relationship with Sicut Cervus in puzzlement and frustration, first trying and often failing to learn the melody of my one part, then struggling to weave my part to the fabric of the whole piece, counting madly the whole time. But sooner than I would have expected, singing it ceased to be work and became something like serious play, a challenging and joyful activity in common with my fellow singers. I don't remember when I first asked myself about Psalm 42 itself, from which comes the line that Palestrina set to music. Perhaps it was during a sophomore seminar on the Psalms, which includes Psalm 42. In any case, I got interested in longing. It seems fitting that the piece of music that has become a sort of theme song for St. John's College, a school full of people looking for a different kind of education, is about longing. What does it mean to long for something or someone? What is it that we long for at St. John's? Do we all long for some version of the same thing, or are there different objects of longing? It is my hope that thinking carefully about Psalm 42 will shed some light on these questions. The psalm itself is not in English, of course. I've looked at both the Hebrew and Greek versions of it, but this lecture will work only with an English translation. Some aspects of the poetry will be impossible to translate, but we will do our best with what we have. Unless otherwise noted, I'll use the New Revised Standard Translation. This lecture will dwell on each of the first 5 verses and then move more quickly through the final 6 verses. The first 5 verses of the psalm are as follows. To the leader, a maskil of the Korahites, as a deer longs for flowing streams, so my soul longs for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and behold the face of God? My tears have become my food day and night, while people say to me continually, where is your God? These things I remember as I pour out my soul, how I went with the throng and led them in procession to the house of God, with glad shouts and songs of thanksgiving, a multitude keeping festival. Why are you cast down, O my soul, and why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my help and my God. Verse 1 begins, to the leader, a maskil of the Korahites. A maskil is some sort of musical piece. Korah was a member of the priestly tribe of Levi during the time of Moses, though not a priest. The beginning of the psalm is the announcement that this is a musical piece written by the descendants of Korah. It seems like a simple attribution. When we look into who Korah was, though, we find something more complicated than we might think. Let's say a little more about Korah, the ancestor of these musical Korahites. To do that, we'll look to the book of Numbers from the Hebrew Scriptures. Our sophomores will soon read the book of Exodus, the story of the escape of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. The book of Numbers right after that, takes up the narrative during the time of desert wandering of this people after their escape from Egypt and before they made it to the land where they settled, the promised land. In it, we learn of an attempted rebellion against the authority of Moses. Korah and his faction challenge Moses, claiming that all should be able to minister to God as priests, not just certain descendants of Aaron, Moses' brother and the high priest. Korah and his friends are calling for egalitarianism in the religious practices and rule of the Israelites. Rather than get into a long argument, Moses gathers the faction together in front of the people and announces that if Korah is correct, that the priesthood of the Israelites can be open to others besides Aaron and his close relations. The Korahite faction will die a normal death. If they are wrong, though, then God will demonstrate it by opening the ground up and swallowing the Korahites immediately. As you may have guessed, it does not go well for Korah, his family, and his supporters. The ground opened up as soon as Moses finished speaking and, quote, swallowed them and their families and all of Korah's people with all their possessions, end quote, from Numbers. Returning to the beginning of Psalm 42, we see that it is said to have been written by the descendants of Korah. Now we face a puzzle. If the ground swallowed up Korah and, quote, all of Korah's people, where did the Korahites come from? Perhaps the account given in the book of Numbers was hyperbolic. Perhaps not every relation of Korah was killed in the rebellion. Some of them may have lived on and had descendants who would become the descendants of Korah who are listed as the authors of the psalm. Maybe these descendants of Korah were not part of the rebellious faction at all, or they were smart enough to see the end coming and hid, or they somehow survived being buried alive. It's not clear at all how these Korahites managed to survive. What is clear is that right at the beginning of our psalm, we are reminded in one phrase, a maskil of the Korahites, of two things. First, conflict and rebellion, which bring on devastating consequences. And second, the fact that a remnant survived the cataclysmic punishment and were received back into the tribe in a musical role. The beginning of the first verse, then, slips in an allusion to a past disastrous rebellion and reassimilation in one short attribution. So much for the introduction to our psalm. Verse 1 continues, "As the deer longs for flowing streams, so does my soul long for you, O God." This is the section that Palestrina sets to music in the motet we are so familiar with at St. John's. Let's consider the comparison that is being made between the attitude of the deer towards flowing streams and the attitude of the psalmist's soul towards God. Both the deer and the psalmist long. In longing, a desire and a need are felt. Both the deer and the psalmist are keenly aware of what they lack. How do they know what they lack? This is something like Meno's question to Socrates about knowledge, given in the dialogue Meno. As you may remember from that dialogue, Socrates expends some effort in getting Meno to ask not how virtue is taught, but the deeper question, what virtue is. At a key moment in the dialogue, Meno asks, "How will you look for what virtue is, Socrates, when you do not know at all what it is? How will you aim to search for something you do not know at all? If you should meet with it, how will you know that this is the thing that you did not know?" It's a good question. How is it possible that we can know what we don't know well enough to know when we found an answer? In the dialogue, Socrates propounds the myth of recollection to show a way in which we might have knowledge deep within ourselves as a not quite lost memory, which the exercise of dialectic can help us to retrieve. It is an explanation that shows how we can both have knowledge and not have it at the same time. Now back to Psalm 42. The question for the deer might be, how does the deer feel the particular lack of flowing streams if it doesn't have them? Instinct, we might say, as if that answers the question. This word instinct seems to mean the deer is constituted in such a way that it just does what it needs to do. It is made to move towards flowing streams. If this is right, the deer has within it a bodily sort of understanding of what it needs. Perhaps something like having knowledge of the forms within ourselves, as Socrates postulates. The psalmist uses the word longs to indicate the response of the deer to a situation in which its needs are not being met, needs that it understands at some level that it is being blocked from fulfilling. In this sense, the streams are both there and not there for the deer. They are there in the sense that the deer knows what it needs, but not there in that the flowing streams are not immediately available. While the New Revised Standard Version translates the original Hebrew as longs, the King James Version translates the word as panteth. As the hart panteth after the water brooks, so panteth my soul for thee, O God. Though the English sounds archaic to our ears, the use of the verb to pant after captures the physicality of the metaphor. This deer is in serious need of water. And I'll take a sip. The psalmist's soul is compared to this longing or panting deer. To push the analogy, the soul has a kind of instinct for God. To go back to the language of instinct I used before, the soul is constituted in such a way that it does what it needs to do. It is made to move towards God. It has an understanding within it of what it needs. The psalmist uses the word longs to indicate the response of his soul to a situation in which its needs are not being met, needs that it understands at some level. The psalmist's soul is being blocked from the thing it needs, in this case, God. To finish the analogy, God is both there and not there for the psalmist. God is there in the sense that the psalmist knows what he needs, but not there in that he feels that God is not immediately available to him. There is clearly another layer to the psalmist's longing, though. God is present as a lack, as I've said, yet the verse ends in the second person. So does my soul long for you, O God. How is it that the psalmist can be talking to God and yet be blocked from God? Does he think God is present enough to hear him speak? Perhaps he doesn't know whether or not God can hear him. Clearly, the soul's need for God is not a need simply to address God in the second person. Something more is desired. Likewise, the deer does not long for something as prosaic as water. It longs for bountiful water coming from a stream that doesn't stop flowing, or more accurately, for streams, plural. One might imagine the difference between a deer lapping up from a puddle and a deer wading through streams, feeling the water flowing past its legs, seeing the many founts of water while it drinks, surrounded by and immersed within the thing it had once longed for, feeling the animal joy of being where it needs to be. This, it seems to me, is what the psalmist longs for with respect to God, not one-sided conversation, but immersion. We get another clue to what exactly the psalmist desires in verse 2, which continues. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and behold the face of God? Did you notice that I didn't use the word thirst at all in examining verse 1? Verse 1 was all about longing. Now we get a restatement of the psalmist's desire for God, but reworded and particularized with a more physical word, thirst. The feeling of thirst is different from hunger, which, though felt in some way throughout the body, is mostly localized in the gut and characterized by pangs, hunger pangs. We may get a dry mouth or throat, but no one talks about pangs of thirst. Instead, when we thirst, the feeling is largely delocalized. We feel all over like a dry sponge that needs to be soaked. Correspondingly, unlike when we eat and feel our stomachs filling, when we drink, we feel our whole bodies taking in the water. Like the deer's longing for flowing streams as opposed to merely water, the psalmist's soul thirsts for God, the living God. More to it, he wonders when he will behold the face of God. We can continue to address our question from verse 1. For what exactly is the psalmist longing if he is already speaking to God? What does it mean to behold someone's face? Before the advent of certain kinds of technology, beholding someone's face would necessarily mean proximity. You can see a body from far away, but it takes a good deal of physical approach before you can really see the face well. One might imagine calling out to someone far away as the psalmist is calling out to God, versus sitting together in intimacy, being in one another's presence. The psalmist evokes the feeling of being with someone alive, beholding the living God's face. Here, finally, we must say a little bit about divinity. In the book of Exodus, Moses alone was able to come close to the divine presence on Mount Sinai and in the tent which held the Ark of the Covenant. When he would come out of the tent, he would veil his face because it was so bright from his intimate interactions with God. By its very nature, the divine is beyond the human. People who get close to God are changed. Perhaps they shine. In the punishment of Korah and his faction, on the other hand, God exhibits terrifying power. In that story, God seems to be saying, "So, you all want to be priests, eh? Well, here's what you risk when you demand to be close to divinity." People who approach God in the wrong way cause and suffer shocking disaster. Yet some of Korah's family does survive, as we've noted. In fact, we are told that the psalmist is one of those descendants. Perhaps this descendant of Korah shares the desire of Korah to be a priest, to be intimately connected to the divine. If so, he has learned something from the story of his ancestor and does not make demands, but rather expresses his longing, his thirst, the full-body desire to go beyond the human and be intimate with the divine. The question of what exactly this intimacy may look like is one we'll keep in mind for the moment. Perhaps we'll be able to shed more light on it as we go. Verse 3 continues, "My tears have been my food day and night, while people say to me continually, 'Where is your God?'" I compared thirst to hunger earlier, noting the localized pangs felt from hunger. Now, the psalmist reveals to us that he has been eating his own tears. It's not clear whether simply metaphorically or perhaps also literally, in an effort to sate himself. In this verse, in addition to the full-body dry sponge experience of thirst for God, he adds the localized pangs of hunger. The image of water in the flowing streams that we began with, longed for by the deer, is now transformed into tears, tears that are food, used surely inadequately to address hunger. What an amazing metaphor is contained in these few words. Drinking tears to sate thirst would be bad enough. I take my own water, pour it out of myself in a salty mess, drink it up, being at best back where I started. Tears as food is worse. There is no hope of relief here. We get an image of the psalmist using his own substance, his tears, in a desperate and doomed attempt to satisfy his needs to no avail. The rest of verse 3 is richly evocative. While people say to me continually, "Where is your God?" His yearning for God is noticed by others around him who ask him where his God is. We can rule out the interpretation of this question as innocent because of the word continually. This is not a commiserating friend making a gentle inquiry. There are many people asking this question over and over again. The psalmist is being mocked unrelentingly. Here, a little more history might help. I began earlier by describing the time of Korah and his faction, a time of desert wandering. This time, for the Israelite people, was followed by a time of war and settlement in the land of Canaan, and later, an era of kings, which our sophomores will read about in the 2 books of Samuel. The one kingdom eventually splits into 2. Both smaller kingdoms are eventually conquered, one by the Assyrians and one by the Babylonians. When the Babylonians conquer the southern kingdom, many of the inhabitants are exiled and forced to live in Babylon. The pain of this exile is evoked in another psalm that our freshmen and sophomores will soon be singing. By the waters of Babylon, we sat down and wept, remembering their lost country. Our psalmist is likely writing from the same perspective, that of exile. Let's posit that he is in exile in Babylon. His country has been demolished by the enemy, and the Babylonians are the ones mocking him, asking him continually, "Where is your God?" We can imagine the implication. The conquerors must be thinking, if your God is so great, why are you here as an exile rather than in your own land? Has your God deserted you? Or else is he too weak to be of any use? In other words, they seem to be saying, your attempt to reach out to the divine for help when your country was attacked has failed publicly and laughably. Now perhaps we have a bit more insight into his longing for God. Is there a tinge of reproach, or at least confusion in verse 3? The Babylonians are asking him where his God is, and he seems to be presenting this question to God, as if asking God, what can I say to them when they ask this question? Where, in fact, are you? The answer seems to be that God is only there for him as a lack, a felt need. For the psalmist, other normal needs, which we all have, including for society and family, are also missing. Rather than taking comfort in the people around him or finding intimacy or friendship, he finds only mockery. He is not alone with his pain, which would be a bad enough situation, but his pain is magnified by the mockery, which brings it to the forefront of his thinking every time they ask him, "Where is your God?" Verse 3 began with the image of him eating his own tears. I can't help but think that he turns to the people around him in some attempt to feed his human needs. He thirsts for God, but perhaps he hungers for companionship, for company in his misery. He is surrounded by people who continually ask him the question he must be asking himself, "Where is your God?" Rather than being fed with companionship, he receives only the salty mess of his own question thrown back at him continually by his conquerors. Now, verse 4. These things I remember as I pour out my soul, how I went with the throng and led them in procession to the house of God with glad shouts and songs of thanksgiving, a multitude keeping festival. In verse 4, we have a recollection. Not a Socratic recollection from before his birth, but a memory of better times. The liquid image continues, not with tears, but with pouring, as his soul is being poured out in memory of the throng of people in procession to the house of God. Unlike his current experience of continually mocking questions, the psalmist remembers with glad cries and songs of thanksgiving. Music and glad shouting bring the multitude of people together into something denoted by one word, a throng. The throng is also headed in a particular direction, to the house of God. The many are together as one. The one throng anticipates arrival at the house of God with joy. No one is asking, "Where is your God?" They all know where God is, in his house, to which they are processing together. Now the longing of the psalmist is given more shape. He was once part of that throng, a group of many that was made one through collective celebration. He longs for God, yes, but in particular, he longs to be where he once was, going to visit God in his house with the crowd, singing and celebrating. Such a different experience of a throng he has now, when it is united, not in joyfully approaching God's house, but in mockery of the psalmist. In his current state, he is alone against a unified crowd, while in his memory, he is one with the joyful group. It is time for a brief detour to think about the one and the many. In Book 7 of the Republic, which our freshmen will be reading in a few weeks, Socrates and Glaucon are discussing the kind of education that would help turn the mind from the messy world of becoming in which we all live to that which simply is. In the midst of this discussion, they turn to number. They are wondering about things that sensibly partake in both oneness and multiplicity, such as a finger that is both big with respect to the pinky and small with respect to the middle finger. One finger having two apparent attributes. The soul, Socrates says, tries to determine whether the big and the small are one thing or two things. Quote, if each is one and both are two, the soul will understand that the two are separate, for it wouldn't understand the inseparable to be two, but rather one. I confess that the first time I read this exchange, I was completely stumped and more than a little annoyed. What is Socrates talking about? Does he really get confused when he looks at a finger? One tip I have for our newer students is this. The sillier an idea sounds to you, if it's offered in all seriousness by someone you respect, the more attention you should pay to it. The more I thought about this problem of seeing opposites within one object, such as the finger that is both big and small, the more I came to see that the questions surrounding number are most profound. Socrates says, if each is one and both are two, the soul will understand that the two are separate, for it wouldn't understand the inseparable to be two, but rather one. How do we know that the big is one and the small is one, and both together are two? What is the difference between two things grouped together as opposites, like big versus small, and two things that are not at all related, such as left and purple? How is it really that one object, such as a finger, can have so many attributes and still be one? In order for two things, whether they be two people, attributes, or fingers, to be called two in a serious way, there must be some principle of integrity that brings the two together, not into one, but into a unified two. For numbers, 1 + 1 always equals 2. For other things, 1 + 1 doesn't always equal 2. For example, pouring 2 cups of water into a big bowl turns the 2 cups of water into one collected volume. Sometimes, two things come together into a unity of sorts. 1 + 1 equals a bigger 1 in the case of water. Bringing together unrelated things, such as left and purple, leads to two-ness of a sort, perhaps 2 items on a list of words, but we can't say much more than that. In some cases, there is no easy-to-find principle of integrity. 1 + 1 equals 1 + 1 in this case. Bringing an index finger and a middle finger together, though, makes 2 fingers. Fingers are one sort of thing. 1 + 1 equals 2 in this case. In the conversation I quoted from earlier in the Republic, big and small naturally go together because they are opposites with respect to size, and size is one sort of thing. We don't experience the world we live in as a mushed together unity where the words big and small are really talking about the same thing, like our cups of water going together to make one bigger volume. Neither do we see a random heap of bits where everything is unrelated, where the big has nothing at all to do with the small. Our world is orderly, a place with kinds of objects and people in it that can be grouped and counted in a serious way. How is it that some things are countable as members of one kind of thing? Where does that integrity come from? In this passage from the Republic, Socrates is mainly interested in the study of things we observe that prompt us to look to that which is. Our psalmist is interested in being in God's presence, seeing the face of God. These two aims are different in some ways, but are not unrelated. Both Socrates and the Psalmist are getting at two different angles of one question, which could be formulated as such. How best can humans encounter that which is beyond the human, which is above the human, and which rules and orders the human in some way? Socrates thinks the study of number will help spur us on to puzzle over being and its relation to becoming. For the psalmist, number is also important, but in an experiential manner. He is experiencing a version of the problem of number that applies to the social lives of people and perhaps deer. Herd animals, like deer, experience each other as either part of the herd or outside the herd. Within the herd, there is order and a hierarchy. Together, the deer roam, perhaps looking for flowing streams. For people, however, there is another level of interaction in language. We can ask pointed questions of each other, questions which set us in opposition to one another, such as asking the conquered exile, "Where is your God?" The crowd of Babylonians is made of many people who are unified in their disdain for the conquered psalmist, a number with a kind of integrity to it. The psalmist is with them in their midst, but alone. As a human being, he feels a connection with the crowd. He and they are of the same kind, and they all know it. He ought to be numbered along with them, but in their disdain, he is severed from them. He remembers being part of another group, though, when he was shouting together with others in gladness, pursuing the divine with the throng. The group he remembers from his past was made of many people who were unified, not only in being human together, but in their destination toward God's house, and in their joy and music. Our psalmist is a one who is cut off from his country and from his God. He experiences the many who are enemies united against him. He remembers being one of a throng, united in joy and song, a community processing to God's house. Part of his thirst for the divine, therefore, seems to be related to a hunger for community. Verse 5 continues, "Why are you cast down, O my soul, and why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my help and my God." The psalmist speaks to his soul now, not pouring it out in memory, as in verse 4, not eating his tears in grief, as in verse 3, and not speaking to a God that is there but not there, as in verse 1. He is mirroring the separation he feels from his companions and from God internally by separating himself into a speaker and that to whom he is speaking, namely his soul. Let's look at how he and his soul get along. He asks his soul, "Why are you disquieted within me?" Unlike when he was questioned by the mockers, this question does not emphasize and inflame the opposition between the questioner and his soul, but seems to come from a place of sympathy. It is the kind of question one might ask a sad child, coming from a place of strength. The implication seems to be that despite appearances, all will be well. There is no reason to remain disquieted, to murmur. On the other hand, unlike in his memory of the procession, he and his soul are not singing together in joy. He is neither wholly integrated, nor is he set completely against himself. Rather, the psalmist and his soul are in sympathy. Unlike with his separation from God, his separation from his own soul is not felt as a lack. He is always present to himself. This must be a comfort to the psalmist. Wherever he is, whoever he is among, by virtue of his self-awareness, he can always talk to his own soul. His soul is not the God for whom he longs, to be sure, but in urging his soul to hope in God, perhaps he is closer to finding the missing God. His soul may feel the lack of God, but the speaker seems to have hope. I shall again praise him, my help and my God. Who is the I the psalmist means here when he says, I shall again praise him? Is it possible that in his hope, the sympathetic division of the self is integrated into one I? Or perhaps the hope he has is exactly for this integration, for a time when he will no longer be divided from God, from the people around him, or from his own soul. The fifth verse of our psalm divides it into two parts. I don't have time in this lecture to parse through the second half of the psalm at the same level of detail I've done for the first 5 verses, but I will say a few words about each verse. The second half of the psalm is a sort of mirror image of the first half, with the images and language of the first half deepened and elaborated in the second. It reads, My soul is cast down within me, therefore I remember you from the land of Jordan and of Hermon and from Mount Mizar. Deep calls to deep at the thunder of your cataracts. All your waves and your billows have gone over me. By day the Lord commands his steadfast love, and at night his song is with me, a prayer to the God of my life. I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why must I walk about mournfully because the enemy oppresses me? As with a deadly wound in my body, my adversaries taunt me, while they say to me continually, where is your God? Why are you cast down, O my soul, and why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my help and my God. Verse 6 acknowledges the downcast state of his soul and brings back a memory, not of the processing throng this time, but of mountains. My soul is cast down within me, therefore I remember you from the land of Jordan and of Hermon, from Mount Mizar. Who is the psalmist talking to here? Who is the you in I remember you? He was addressing his soul in verse 5. The beginning of verse 6 refers to his soul in the third person, though, so he seems to be addressing God again, remembering God and the terrain of his homeland. We've left the liquid language of flowing streams and tears for a brief moment and are now on solid ground in the mountains. Verse 7 brings back the water. Deep calls to deep at the thunder of your cataracts. All your waves and your billows have gone over me. The image of water returns here as an image of rivers cascading down the mountains of verse 6, overwhelming the psalmist. This is no flowing stream that a deer could walk through and drink from. In this verse, it is as if all the waters of the deep oceans are found in the waters that rush down the mountains of his homeland, overwhelming him. The solid landscape he remembers in verse 6 turns, within one verse, into the overwhelming cataracts of defeat and exile. Verse 8 moves away from the image of overwhelming water. By day, the Lord commands his steadfast love, and at night his song is with me, a prayer to the God of my life. Regardless of where he is, whether in procession in his homeland or exiled and mocked, God's love is with the psalmist. The song of the procession in memory has been brought into the present and changed. At night, his song is with me. From verse 6 to 7, we saw a move from solid ground to dangerous water. In verse 8, we see a move from the cataracts back to song. The psalmist seems to be flipping between hope and despair. In the midst of this back and forth movement, verses 9 and 10 bring back the question that has been hovering over the psalm since verse 3, namely, where is your God? I say to my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why must I walk about mournfully because the enemy oppresses me? As with a deadly wound in my body, my adversaries taunt me, while they say to me continually, where is your God? In verse 9, God appears neither as a refreshing stream nor a deep ocean, but as a rock. The psalmist is at his most direct in this speech. He finally asks God directly why he has seemingly been forgotten. Again, the shift between verse 8 and verse 9 is startling. In verse 8, the psalmist is in the midst of steadfast love, song, and prayer. One verse later, he is claiming implicitly that God has forgotten him and left him to suffer the deadly wound of the mockers. The question, "Where is your God?" is invoked again. The repetition of this question, after so much back and forth between hope and despair, increases the stakes of the question. Is God there for him even now, as steadfast love during the day, a song at night? Or is he absent, leaving the psalmist to die from the deadly wound of the mocking conquerors? Is the psalmist overwhelmed in the white water of rushing forces, or is he solidly ensconced on the rock? There is no explicit answer given to this heartfelt question. The final verse, though, recapitulates verse 5 and is an answer of sorts. "Why are you cast down, O my soul, and why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my help and my God." The alternation of hope and despair has ended in hope. Summary. Over the course of this lecture, I have discussed a number of images and ideas, most notably community and division. The psalm begins with an allusion to division and conflict in the descendants of Korah, the putative authors of the psalm. Korah and his friends challenged their community with disastrous results. The very fact of the Korahites' existence implies that reassimilation has occurred, but some of the descendants of Korah survived and were reintegrated into the community. The psalm proper begins with longing, the feeling of separation and lack that the deer feels for the flowing streams, and the psalmist feels for his God. We heard about thirst, the dry sponge feeling of need, and hunger, the localized pang of emptiness, which cannot be sated by tears. The specifics of the psalmist's need were filled in a bit when we heard of his community, broken not by rebellion, as with the Korahites, but by being conquered. Community is replaced with mockery, the explicit antagonism that comes when the many exclude the one, bringing the psalmist's pain to the surface with the question, which is an echo of his own question, "Where is your God?" The memory of his former life comes up as the psalmist pours out his soul, recalling the processing throng with its oneness in the many, all of them with the goal of immersing themselves in the presence of God, that which is above the human and which orders the human. Then his division from the people around him and from God is internalized as he speaks to his own soul, recommending hope and thus perhaps finding a hint of reassimilation. In the second part of the psalm, the psalmist alternates between hope and despair, between the solidity of mountains and the billowing waves. The land images come together with the water images to form cataracts which overwhelm him. He finds the words to finally ask God the question that has been lurking: "Why have you forgotten me?" The pain of his present situation comes to a head with the invocation of the deadly wound he experiences from the taunts of his captors. But the psalm ends with a repetition of his call for renewed hope. Throughout these images, the question of integrity and wholeness lurks. The psalmist is divided from God, from the people around him, from his country, and from himself. Yet the division is not complete. He speaks to God even as he thirsts for him. He recollects being together with the throng before his country was conquered, making them present, if only in memory. He offers sympathy to himself, coming together with his own grief and hope. What does the question of number look like if we are not the ones counting, but are experiencing life as the one counted, a one who is separated from our kind, feeling the pull towards integrity and returning to where we belong? The many images of water enhance the question of number and kind, of integrity and wholeness. One gets the sense that the throng he remembers singing and worshiping with is something like a flowing stream of water, as much like a stream as a group of people can be. Like the deer, though, who wants to be immersed but not drowned in the streams, the psalmist wants to be immersed in his community but not to disappear into it. He longs for the kind of union in which individuality is retained in the midst of the throng. He longs for intimacy with God, especially as experienced with his fellow worshipers, when each individual moved as an individual, but altogether moved in common. The uniformity and transcendence of their collective goal gave them a collective joy without diminishing their own integrity. The question, how can the psalmist discover or rediscover that transcendent goal, is related, I think, to the question, where is your God? Conclusion. If my contention is right, that the psalmist longs, at least in part, for the sort of communal experience in which he would remain himself while at the same time being together with the group in a transcendent activity, it would be hard to come up with a more apt instantiation of this than the polyphonic masterpiece of Palestrina. The interlocking of distinct melodies, which is the hallmark of polyphonic music, creates a particular kind of complexity. It's not possible for one person to sing the piece in a recognizable way. Sicut Cervus, someone might say. How does that go? There is no answer that one person can give that is adequate without reaching for a recording of the piece. In contrast, if someone asks about Mozart's Ave Verum Corpus or St. Thomas Aquinas' Pange Lingua, the person who knows the piece can hum, sing, or whistle the melody, and the questioner will be able to recognize it. In Polyphony, the multiplicity of voices is inherent to what makes it a recognizable piece of music. There is no one melody to hum, but many melodies, all woven together. When we sing the piece at St. John's, we often stretch out the final two chords, holding them longer than the score calls for, soaking in the sudden cessation of four-part motion, which ends in a pool, so to speak, of the A-flat major chord. As singers, not just listeners, we feel all of this physically. The ear picks up the sound, but the body feels the vibrations. The quick movements bring the singers through dissonances to consonances and vice versa. Each dissonance is felt as a slight jar on the way to the moments when harmony comes to be. I used the language of immersion just now to describe how we soak in the final two chords. This was meant to evoke the experience of singing in a group, feeling how the pitch I sing, which vibrates in my vocal cords and in my body, interacts with the pitches being sung all around me, sometimes clashing, sometimes reinforcing. As we sing the piece, we move from the cataracts of the polyphonic motion to the pools of those final two chords. In the very act of singing about longing, then, we are giving ourselves a hint of the satisfaction of that longing. It seems fitting to me that Palestrina's motet has become so beloved at St. John's, though who could ever have predicted it? We are all searching for something here. As a community of learning, we long together to learn. We read authors who say things worth thinking about. We help each other by sharing our questions and ideas. We are a secular school, formed from people who come out of their own communities, with their own religions, races, creeds, and families. Is there something like the joyful procession of our psalmist going on in our classrooms? What do we long for? The truth? Understanding? Wisdom? Beauty? Where is our God? Perhaps we aren't able to put into words what we are seeking, or perhaps what we say would change from person to person, from day to day, or from year to year. Still, time and again, in each class, the individual participants make something else happen, something between, among, and beyond any one person. The fact that this amazing and beautiful thing happens so often and routinely makes me think that regardless of the vast differences among us, we are all heading in the same direction. Thank you.